When I was a teenager, the show Jackass was at its ultimate height of cultural significance. And this is back when people would do crazy shit and wouldn't even film it. It makes me think that now, since people only do these stunts so they could post them on social media later, the whole landscape has become a lot more tame. Like, I remember being over my best friend at the time, Bruce's house, and we watched his older brother drive a moped off the roof of the crib onto the ground. No phones in sight, just people living in the moment. I swear, anthropologists ought to study the effects Jackass had on that generation of men, because it was very common for a group of dudes just to hit each other in the nutsack and everybody would laugh about it. I remember multiple instances sitting in the back seat of cars where the driver just all of a sudden decided to attempt to get their car up past 100 miles an hour, even if we were driving down a windy back road. And they'd do that shit just for the experience, not even for the adrenaline or for a story they could tell their boys later on. Half the time we wouldn't even talk about it after this shit happened. I think that specific brand of having fun was unique to that cultural moment in history, because I couldn't imagine the boomers doing that, and if it was a car full of Gen Zers, then you bet somebody would post it online. There must have been something in the water back then, or that was before they started putting something in the water, because the seniors when I was a freshman all looked like they were 30 years old. And by the time I was leaving high school, all the up-and-coming seniors looked like the prototypical skinny Zoomer that you can imagine today. See, demographically, I'm a Zoomer, but I'm the oldest Zoomer, so all the people who were above me in school were millennials, and all the people who were below me were the oldest members of Gen Z. See, older Zoomers are pretty much a silent generation. We're basically the forgotten analog gigachads of the mid-2000s. We often get lumped in with the cradle-to-grave iPad Zoomers, but we remember when the computer had its own location in the house and people watched TV in the living room. So when the young adults were all doing Jackass stunts, we were able to be onlookers, but we were still too young to participate. So that's why I liked going over my buddy Bruce's house. His crib was pretty much a free-for-all, and our dads knew each other through hockey, so I was allowed to go over there, but the adults were just not present. And I always looked up to Bruce's brother. He was about 4 years older than us in school, but he was one of those seniors who looked like he was 30. So through him, I got a sense of what it was like to be a part of that last batch of millennials where smartphones really weren't a thing yet, but everybody had a flip phone. And everybody had a car too, because a junker was super obtainable. We're talking like $2,000, and you'd have a decent engine that would last you. So everybody had wheels and a talk and text cell phone, and all the while social media was just something you did on a computer at home. So from my perspective as an outsider looking in, the whole thing looked like a mix between the movies Dazed and Confused and Project X. Like, the parties they were throwing is essentially what Project X was based off of. And then a lot changed over 4 years. By the time my class became seniors, there was about 2 smartphones between every 4 people. So we were all obsessed with trying to start a Project X style party, but we were a bit too efficient with it because of social media and also because of phones. It got busted pretty quick, pretty often. But it was nothing compared to the freedom that the older generations experienced and I witnessed before technology took over. So what me and Bruce would do is we'd catch wind of parties that were going on, not ones that his brother invited us to, because he would never do that, and he would never bring us to them either. But what we did do is just show up when the parties were already in full swing and immediately associate ourselves with the people who knew his brother, and people would never kick us out because we were clicked up. Except for one time. We did in fact get kicked out one time by some drunk football player who just couldn't be reasoned with. And to give you a little bit more of an idea of how things have changed, I believe that drunk football player dude actually owned that house off of a blue-collar job while he was like 20 years old. But anyway, getting kicked out was no problem to us. We just did what we were gonna do when the party ended anyway. We just walked the streets and caused light mischief. This is when I was at that age where you're not yet old enough to buy a car, so our go-to was just to walk everywhere. Like, I wasn't gonna bother a family member by calling them and having them pick me up, because that would have meant the party was over. My goal was to stay out as long as possible and spend time chilling with my friends. So unless we could get in touch with a homie who had access to wheels to come scoop us, we were out on our own, and we were walking. We called it Nightcrawlers. And the goal of a game of Nightcrawlers was to walk either to Bruce's house or to our other friend's house, Dan, who also had a house where his parents were pretty much checked out. Actually, it was a pretty rare occurrence to see any adults at Dan's house. I think he lived with his grandmother, but she was one of those old ladies who's basically too old to know what's going on around her. And to the best of my knowledge, his dad was in jail. To my young, underdeveloped mind, that's where his dad was. I think I saw him driving a motorcycle 1 or 2 times, but as far as I knew, the dude was just in and out of prison. And Dan was a day one as well. However, he had been expelled somewhere along the line, but everybody in our friend group had some memory of sharing a class with him in primary school or some such early year of school like that. So going to Dan's house was always a last resort option for everybody in our friend group because everybody was in contact with him, but for some reason, Bruce was the only one who actively wanted to go see him. And understandably so, all things considered, Dan was, for lack of a better term, quite unhinged. And he had an older sister who Bruce had the hots for, and Bruce wasn't playing with a full deck mentally either. I'm sorry, but looking back, they all seem to have this obsession with fighting, and they also had a few screws loose collectively. So an afternoon at Dan's house was always teetering on the verge of going from juvenile antics to full-blown rule by the mob. So now you might be wondering why I subjected myself to spending time amongst these people. Well, all the while I had a perfectly loving home. And I don't really have a good answer to that. There's really no way to justify it. I guess the only answer I could give is that I was young, stupid, and bored. Also, I found it interesting. Dan's house actually could have been the perfect hangout spot if they would just tone down the violence a little bit and not be so eager to pull out the boxing gloves and test each other. But sometimes friend groups are just like that. You punch each other in the arm every once in a while, but at the end of the day, you get along. And what matters most when it comes to that is really about loyalty. And I gotta give Bruce and Dan credit on that front because both of them were true ride or dies. They would be in the trenches with you. I mean, shit, Bruce and I were literally walking on the street. And we were walking to Dan's house uninvited because he had an open invitation extended to us and he would be happy to see us show up at his door. Like, Bruce was the only friend who I could possibly even imagine crashing senior parties with because I knew if somebody ever tried something with me, this dude would be there if there was anything that ever broke out. And all things considered, the three of us were a pretty good trio. We had each other's backs and shit was pretty cool most of the time. And it was awesome hanging out with them, but they were just dangerous people to be in proximity to. Like Dan, for instance, would always drive like a maniac anytime he could get his hands on his grandmother's keys. He was one of those type of people who would always try to get his car up past 100. Basically, anytime I'd return home from hanging out with those guys, I would have experienced at least 3 life or death situations. Actually, remember Robert, who I talked about in the last video? One time he went over Dan's house and he got his ass beat in a boxing match. It was kind of a trick they pulled on people who didn't go over the house too often. They'd ask him if they wanted to put on the gloves and spar a little bit, but it was never really light sparring. And Robert was never the type to want to do MMA or any physical type sport like that. Nor am I, for that matter, but I can at least hold my own. But Bruce and Dan were basically obsessed with fighting. I mean, they basically emulated their entire personalities off of that movie The Fighter with Mark Wahlberg. But Bruce's dad was oddly supportive of it. Like, he would show us the old VHS tapes of the original Mickey Ward fight, and he had a big punching bag set up at his house. So I guess if anybody in our circles actually had the potential to go anywhere in the world of professional fighting, then those would have probably been good avenues for him. I mean, not to throw shade, but it does make sense that a dude who has trouble heating his house in the winter would look up to a man like Mickey Ward, who was the pride of Lowell, and we all lived right next to Lowell. By that I mean to say that Bruce's dad had some glimmer of hope that he would take part in the raising of the next Mickey Ward and get us all out of the hood with his professional fighting career, but really all that came out of it was recreational, needless violence. So now we'll get to the point of the story where I explain the circumstances that led to me ghosting out of that friend dynamic. So about half a year later, I bought my first car, but I was still too early in having my license to be able to drive with a passenger legally. And I know a lot of people often disregard that rule, like as soon as they get their license, their car is full of people, but not me. I followed that rule to the letter, and I also used it as an excuse not to give people rides. So my car's parked at Dan's house. It's me, Bruce, Dan, Dan's sister, and Dan's sister's friend. I don't remember Dan's sister's friend's name, so we'll just call her Vicky. So for some reason, we all get it in our heads that we're going to go over to Vicky's apartment, and that's where the night's going to take place. But since my whole license not allowing me to have passengers thing, I was refusing to give everybody a ride. So I caught some light shit for that, understandably, and ultimately the decision was made that Dan was going to drive everybody there in Vicky's car because Vicky had already had too much to drink. So we all pile into this old-ass Jeep, and I just leave my car parked at Dan's house. And of course, Dan drives like a maniac on the highway and in the city, and the entire time all they do is crack these stupid drunk jokes about how I'm too careful of a driver or something like that. The type of shit you'd expect, but that Vicky chick just seemed like she was taking real personal offense to just my entire existence. She was basically annoyed and blaming me because we had to use her car car and I got to leave mine parked at Dan's house. But like, we're driving to her apartment in the first place. Like, aren't you gonna need your car there anyway? But my mind wasn't on any of that. I was just noticing how terrible of a driver Dan is, and all the while he's acting like he's mogging me because of how reckless he can drive. And since I'm on the road myself now, I have a pretty good developing sense of what makes a person a good driver and why it's not worth it to drive crazy. So his whole shtick of driving like a maniac and risking all of our lives just for the adrenaline rush and the joke of it all, well, it's just getting old for me, and I'm waiting for it all to be over. So we get to Vicky's apartment, and right from the beginning, just looking at this place, I know it's going to be a bad night. See, Vicky was like a mid-2000s heavy metal chick, so her apartment looked exactly like you'd expect. Complete with trash everywhere, holes in the walls from people punching them, and a big Cannibal Corpse poster in the living room. Immediately once we're in there, Dan's sister's like, let me see it. So the two of them fuck off to the back room for a little bit and later came out with a taser. And that was my first time seeing one of those things. Luckily it was out of batteries. Vicky claimed the charger had been stolen. And of course Dan's sister's like, oh, I have a charger for one of those at home, but thank God she forgot it. There was a couple other people there. One of them was a local burnout who everybody called Scooter, but he wasn't there to chill with us. He mostly just kept to himself, and for some time he was chilling on the couch and then eventually left. And Vicky also had a roommate, but I only saw that person once because they mostly spent the entire night locked in their room because they didn't want to have anything to do with what was going on outside. And I don't blame them. Personally, I was questioning what I was doing in that situation anyway. There was at one point where Dan's sister put Scooter in a sleeper hold and bro basically passed out on the couch for 15 minutes. And Dan's sister was worse when it came to the violent shit than anybody else. So what they basically started doing, besides drinking more, was engaging in these amateurish wrestling matches where they'd all try to take turns pinning each other down, but I was taking no part in that. And all the while, that Vicky chick seemed like she was getting more and more pissed off at me, and her and the sister were basically just waiting to have any excuse to clown on me. So a little while later, they challenged me to a game of beer pong, and Dan's sister basically tells me that she's gonna fuck me up if I lose. And I could tell she wasn't joking, even though she was making it seem like she was. It was the sort of thing that wasn't totally serious, but it could lead to me getting cold clocked later in the night. If you want to get an idea of what hanging out with this group of people was like, just look up the 1997 movie Gummo and search for the scene where they fight the chair, and you'll know exactly what I mean. So the beer pong game started, and I was playing the best game I've ever played my entire life. I mean, I'm cracked at beer pong as it is, but in this instance, I probably played the best game of my life. So it goes without saying that I kicked all their asses, and I won bragging rights, and basically through that, I won the right not to get my ass kicked that night. I definitely spared myself some bruises, to put it lightly, and through that, I think I exempted myself from any boxing match that would have happened later on. At least in this particular circumstance, but it would only get me resentment later on. The thing with these people is that you always had to prove yourself through some sort of competitive bullshit, and a lot of the time it would get you injured. So not too soon after that, pretty much everybody there except for me passed out drunk, so I was essentially just wandering around the apartment by myself, waiting for Vicky to wake up so she could drive me home. Or at least that was the only advice people were giving me. They're like, oh, Vicky's gonna give you a ride home when she wakes up. But I'm like, fuck that. I just waited for the first crack of dawn and I dipped out immediately. And once I was out of there, I just walked. I walked in the direction of Dan's house. Eventually I decided I'd get on a bus, and the bus only took me within like 7 miles of his crib. And I did a lot of thinking on that 7-mile walk to go retrieve my car. And that day I made up my mind that I had outgrown this friend group. So I made it to Dan's house, I got in my car, and I drove away from that house for the last time. And the entire time driving home, I was just processing what had just happened, and I came to the realization that fuck them. There's no way I'm going to hang out with a group of so-called friends who are always going to want to kick my ass, jokingly, but not so jokingly. And plus now I had a car of my own, so there was no need to play Nightcrawlers or go hang out at people's houses because there's nothing else to do. I could find my own shit to do, or just go home and come out later. So after that day, I never saw Dan or his sister again. They did tell me over social media one time that they were going to kick my ass, and I'm not sure if they were joking or not. It was always half joking when it came to that type of stuff with them. Like, they really wanted to chill, but to them, chilling just involved the violent shit. And I had really just matured past that stage of my life. And plus, seeing Vicky's apartment was kind of a wake-up call to what could happen to me if I continued down this road, and I resolved that I would aim for a better life. As for Bruce, we still chilled a few times after that, but bro eventually moved to to Texas. He actually joined the military later on and now has a family. So all things considered, this is a perfect example of just growing out of the friend group you have when you were younger. And one of the reasons we don't hold on to the old friendships we had during that era, because it just becomes stupid the older you get to act like that. But I gotta say, if I was sitting at a bar today and I looked up, it was Dan and Bruce walking through the door, I would definitely be excited to sit down and have a beer with them and just reminisce about old times. So I hope this story helps somebody. If you have a group of friends who you feel like are just putting you in physical danger, there's nothing wrong with dipping out of that friend group. And you don't have to be dramatic about it. Just keep your best interest in mind.